Hello once again, it's Tyler Buchheit coming to you from Southwest Illinois on behalf of Steiner Tractor Parts. We're here with the old 630, for which you've gotten so familiar on numerous other repair videos. Today we're looking at replacing the radiator core on a John Deere tractor. If this is something you've never attempted before, I'd encourage you to boost your intestinal fortitude because it can be trying on the wits. A lot of times you get snap bolts, twisted off, numerous other hardware items that are very rusty and they have maybe not been out since the tractors were new. In this case, some time ago, I had installed a new radiator neck because I had realized the old one was leaking and did not allow the system to build pressure. These systems should maintain pressure once they're warmed up to increase cooling efficiency. So once I did that, installed a new cap at the same time and ended up with holes in my radiator core, which is original, 1959, so go figure, it's had a good life. But with a couple cans of stop leak, still realized that my leak was slowed but not fixed. So we're going to be installing a new radiator core in the tractor. This will show you the basics of the radiator core are going to be similar on all the other Waterloo built John Deere models. Some may or may not have power steering, of course, but the overall notion is going to be similar on your numbered series tractors as well as your lettered series tractors. The biggest difference is removing the sheet metal. So when we come back, we'll have the hood removed, weights removed, and drain our cooling system and begin the fun. Alright, so we've done a little work since the last clip. We've went ahead and drained and flushed our cooling system, so we're ready to go in that sense. We all want to make sure that not only we get the old antifreeze out, but we want to remove any rust, sediment deposits. There's a lot of radiator flush products that are out there. Feel free to use those, whatever your choice is. Or just a good flush with water is a great place to start. We've also removed our sheet metal, front end weights on this tractor from the last time you saw me. We removed our air cleaner assembly because it is supported and held by the top of the radiator tank, so that's got to be removed. We've also drained our power steering system of oil, and it's really so important to note, if you don't want to have to touch your power steering system or use it to a minimum, if you have a 50, 60, or 70, or any of the 20 series tractors, you can simply pull your steering shaft out. You can remove every other bolt in your steering pedestal by lifting it up, and you can literally turn the pedestal in the housing. You don't even have to take off your roll-o-matic. If you've got a wide front, you'll have to disconnect the steering arm underneath for your drag links. But if you remove every other bolt, and you have to look to see which one's actually the longer bolts. Every other bolt is short and long. So you remove the long bolts, the short ones keep the pedestal together. You can rotate the housing such that your steering arm on this side is out of the way for the radiator. Then you can lift the radiator up and out. I would not recommend disassembling the radiator in the tractor. I'd much rather do that on a workbench. Can be done in a tractor, however. But in regard to drilling out bolts and seeing what you're doing, much better to have your radiator on a workbench or work table. We'll also have to remove the power steering pump lines, both the pressure and the sump line. We've had to disconnect our exhaust pipe that goes up to the muffler, take the muffler air cleaner off, and so on. Other than that, next step will be, in our case, because we have a 30 series tractor, we're going to have to take off the worm gear assembly from the power steering system. Disassemble, remove it, and simply slide it off of the shaft. Then we'll be able to get at our radiator. Alright, so we got our radiator out of our tractor, got it on our work table, and went to work disassembling. And you want to take out all the little bolts first, and there's these little bars on the top and bottom and the core of each side. So there's 4 total, and we got 5/16 bolts. And to my amazement, all these little bolts came out, didn't break off a single one. When we got to some of the bigger bolts, didn't break any of those off. But as you'll see right here, on one of the lower sides, where there must have been a bunch of debris accumulated over time, it rusted the head of the bolts so that you couldn't get a socket on. It completely deformed them. So what I did, wearing hearing and vision protection, took my cutoff saw, my angle grinder, and cut the heads off, and then from there we just pulled the bottom tank off, as you can see here. Something invaluable for a job like this is a small 3/8 or 1/4 inch drive cordless impact. Something that's not going to be too big and too powerful to want to snap bolts, but set up some impact to start bringing them, taking things loose. So it's the exception and not the rule when you take a radiator apart and don't twist off any bolts. I think from just looking at some of the evidence that perhaps this radiator had been cored and clean at some point in its life. I suspect it's been apart since 1959, but albeit not recently. Additionally, something else we're going to replace, not only the core, Steiner Tractor Parts provides new fan shrouds. Ours is really getting pretty rusted out at the bottom, and that's common to find them damaged at the bottom because they're at the bottom, debris and residue accumulates over time, gets wet, and corrodes the metal. So this one here in particular is a JDS 774. Brand new. Almost looks powder coated, maybe, but looks just like the original. It'll fit and work great with our new core. Aside from that, we're going to go ahead and remove the sides from our old core and clean everything up and work on installing a new core when we get back. I should also mention, it'd be a good idea upon reassembly to use anti-seize lubricants. Anti-seize from all the bolt threads, and we're going to be installing the core with a new radiator bolt kit, which I'll show you in just a moment. Okay, we've been doing a little cleaning since you last checked in. We've got the radiator tanks, the top and bottom sealing surfaces cleaned up good. I love to use a die grinder and an abrasive pad or like a 3M pad. Makes cleanup much faster, much easier. While we're here, we're also going to replace gaskets on our upper water housing. I'd highly recommend, anytime you have a radiator out of a tractor, you always want to replace gaskets and O-rings every single connection point you can. How foolish you would feel after having gone through the trouble of putting in a core only to have a leak in a place that you didn't address or forgot to. Things like the little packings that were going to be for our water bypass tube and our thermostat housing. There's O-rings inside our thermostat housing as well as our upper water neck on the engine block. These tubes, the sealing surfaces, as you can see, get kind of nasty. Sometimes these tubes get a lot of rust pitting. When reassembling these, personally, I like to use, instead of a lubricant, I like to use RTV silicone because until it sets up, it acts like a lubricant to lubricate the O-rings while you're trying to insert the tubes. Just a trick, and when you go to insert the tubes, don't just try to push them straight into the O-ring. Give a twisting action. Something I like to use, a large adjustable wrench like this, as you to twist at the same time as you insert. It helps to ease them into the O-ring because it is a fairly tight fit. You also want to make sure that there's no sharp edges on your end of your tube. Sometimes rust pitting can make that a bigger problem. While we're here, of course, we're going to replace thermostats. You've got it apart. Thermostat's pretty inexpensive. You always want to make sure to do that. Always remember on your thermostat, the part that's affected by heat you want toward the engine where the heat is coming from. So this is the upper side toward the radiator, toward the engine. Also, additionally, depending on the model tractor you're working with, you may have steel tube connections and O-ring connections only. You may have a piece of radiator hose to connect. While this hose wasn't leaking, it's time to replace. Do it now and forget about it, and know that when you're at plow day, when you're at a parade, know that you're not going to have to worry about leaks coming from those areas. So next step will be installing our core. I'm going to take my housings out and power wash them to get all the rust and grime and gunk and just nasty stuff that's inside of a cooling system. So we'll come back and we'll have some clean housings and be installing the radiator core. All right, we're back from outside. We just got done pressure washing and drying off our upper and lower water tanks, as well as our upper and water neck. Over time, there's a lot of rust and other deposits that, even with rust inhibitors in our coolant, provided that coolant gets changed on a regular basis, which many of these old tractors haven't. Washed all this out as best I could with my pressure washer, top and bottom tank, so got that clean. I've prepped my gasket surfaces top and bottom. And we've gone ahead and prior to putting in our radiator sides, we double checked our gaskets on the top and bottom. On this particular application, the holes, these holes here on the outer part where your uprights go in the radiator are not even. These holes in here are equidistant. It doesn't matter which way your gasket's flipped, but it does make a difference which way you've got it on here. So what we need to do before putting everything together, make sure your holes line up and check, because there is, at least in this application, a difference between the holes in the top and the bottom, or the front and the back rather. So before fastening anything, if holes do not line up, please double check just to make sure that your core is oriented correctly in the side plates. Once you determine that with the top and bottom, one other thing. In regard to where our shroud goes on, our sides are going to be different on the back facing the rear of the tractor versus the front, because this is the area in which our holes are in place for our fan shroud. So things to take note of. For this application, we are going to use an RTV silicone on the gaskets. We'll coat both sides of the gaskets, metal surfaces. We just want to make sure our surfaces are free of any foreign material. Would highly recommend brake cleaner to clean those surfaces to get any oil or residue off, but give that plenty of time to dry prior to installing the RTVs so it doesn't interfere. So what we'll do, we'll start with the bottom tank, installing it first. And once we have that done with our gasket in between, we'll flip around and put the top tank on. Once we're to that point, we'll go ahead and reinstall our radiator in the tractor, and we'll come back in a minute for more video there. So we got the bottom tank installed onto the radiator core with the side pieces. Anti-seize all the bolts. Number one thing to do. With this handy dandy fastener kit available from Steiner, made reassembly quite easy. There's no way I would ever reuse your old hardware on a radiator project. It's just not worth it. You're asking for problems down the road should you or your ancestors, or not ancestors, but the generations to come, ever have to deal with it again. So we started by getting all the nuts and bolts in their holes but not tight. And just out of habit, I like starting in the middle and tightening up toward the outer edge. Alright, so we've set our radiator on the tractor. Now, in my case, I had my brother, who's filming right now, help with setting the radiator up on the other side of the frame rail. I stabilized, and he came around to this side, and then we gently maneuvered the radiator into place. That was with two people. If you're by yourself, you're going to want to use an overhead hoist, a gantry crane, or an engine hoist, something elevated to put it in. Obviously, you do not want to punch a hole in your brand new radiator core while you're putting everything back in place. Also want to mention, in a case like this, we would have had the water neck attached. That would have created some problems in installing the fan shroud. So we took this off ahead of time, which we wanted to put new gaskets in place anyway. But to install the shroud, we slid the shroud past the fan up here while we maneuvered the radiator into place, and then we just simply slid the shroud around the fan, and we'll bolt it fast to the radiator in a bit. We're going to go ahead and mount the radiator with the two large bolts underneath the fan shroud, and then start reassembling. So I also should mention, and I forgot to mention this earlier, when you're doing a radiator core, you want to make sure your water pump, if your tractor is equipped with a water pump, is in good shape. While the water pump's off, you can spin it by hand, feel the bearing. If there's any roughness in the bearing, the water pump either needs to be overhauled, or you can buy a new water pump, brand new everything through Steiner Tractor Parts. Ours is actually an older rebuild that's only a couple years old, so I know that the bearing and seal are in good shape, and I checked them, which they are. So we'll go ahead and continue the reassemble and come back to you when it's time to put something in and check for leaks. What a great feeling it is to be at the end of a project like this, installing a radiator core in an old John Deere tractor. Our 630 cooling system is back up to where it was when it left the factory in 1959. We know now the coolant's going to stay in and our engine is going to be regulated to the proper temp now that we've got a working thermostat and we don't have any leaks. So one other thing I should mention is as you put together a list of parts for your project, don't forget some of those ancillary items, hoses for radiators, obviously related items, but even things like air intake tubes and hoses, things like power steering plug. This is a JDS 490. Our old plug was about to fall out, so we've got a new one in place to kind of put a bow on this project. We've test run our tractor prior to installing the sheet metal to determine that there weren't any leaks or any other issues that needed to be addressed prior to putting on our sheet metal. Don't forget to visit steinertractor.com for your tractor parts needs, and best of luck to you on your project.